We are on the very bottom of Beis Amud Beis, and we've just established that according to Rav, there is a direct connection between the Heichal door and the halacha of the doorway of a mavoi. And furthermore, Chazal, basically according to Rav, Chazal, when they fashioned the halacha of the mavoi, they based it upon the specifications of the Heichal. Okay? So, the Gemara now says, and according to Rav, this is so much so, that regardless of whether you have a tzuras HaPesach, a door frame or not, the doorway cannot go beyond the dimensions of the Heichal. It has to be no more than 10 wide and 20 high. So the Gemara says, last two words of Beis Amud Beis, Elamei Ata, Lo Tihani Le Amaltara. I'm not sure how to pronounce that word, but I made up the pronunciation, Amaltara. If that's the case, the Gemara says, then having an Amaltara, which we'll define shortly, above the door should not allow you to create a doorway higher than 20 amos. Because we know that the Heichal also had an Amaltara above the door frame, and yet its maximal dimensions were 20 amos. And as we'll see momentarily, when you put an Amaltara above a Pesach in a Mavoi, it could be higher than 20 amos, and that seems to contradict this whole correlation that we've made. Ditnan, as the Mishnah says, how do you know that the Heichal had an Amaltara? It says, Chamesh Amaltaraos shel Mila hayu al gabav zu lamalo mizu v'zu lamailo mizu. There's a Mishnah in Maseches Midos that says that there were 5 layers of Amaltara wood. Rashi says this is the wood of the golnut tree, and they made a certain kind of accessory to the door frame above the door frame made from this kind of wood. And we're going to define what kind of accessory it is. It's an Amaltara accessory. And there were 5 layers of it. And this had a very distinctive kind of appearance when you would look at it. And the Gemara says, you see from here that the Heichal also had this special feature, and yet it's limited to 20 amos high. So before we get to the kasha, which is that we know that if you make a Pesach higher than 20 amos, as long as there's an Amaltara on it, it's okay. The Gemara says, wait a minute, how do you know that that Mishnah in Maseches Midos is talking about the doorway of the Heichal? Maybe that Mishnah is talking about the doorway of the Ulam, which is not our source exemplar to correlate to the halachas of the Pesach of a Mavoi. Maybe that Mishnah, which talks about the Amaltara, the Heichal didn't have the Amaltara. Bahai my kushya, dilma tavnus Heichal ketavnus ulam. The Gemara says, no, that's not a problem, even if the Mishnah was talking about the Ulam doorway, but it stands to reason that if the Ulam doorway had the Amaltaras on it, the Heichal also had the Amaltaras on it. If this was something that was distinctive and a feature of distinction, then why wouldn't both of the doorways have it on them? So therefore the Gemara says, we can clearly conclude that the Heichal doorway had Amaltaras on it, and yet it's still limited to 20 amos. So Alama Amar Rabbi Ilah Amar Rav Rechava Dalet Afal Pi She'ena Beria V'im Yesh La Amaltara Afilu Gavoa Yoser Me Esrim Ama Eino Sarech L'Mayit. Rav said 2 halachas in this mimer. Rav's 2 halachas were that, number 1, as we're going to see, one of the ways that you create a visual feature of your door frame is by putting a korah, is by putting a crossbeam on top of the entrance to the mavoi. We learned that yesterday, right? So the Gemara says that it's necessary that it not be too flimsy. It has to be able to support at least a brick. If you put a brick on top of that crossbeam, it would be able to support it. The exception, however, says Rav, if the width of that plank is 4 tfachim or wider, then even if it's flimsy, it cannot support the weight of a brick, it's still kosher. That's kula number 1 that Rav had presented. And kula number 2 that Rav presented is that even if the doorway is higher than 20, as long as there's an Amaltara on top of the doorway, it's still a kosher doorway for the mavoi. So we have a direct contradiction between 2 statements of Rav. One statement of Rav is that you have to, the specifications of the doorway of the mavoi have to be not any greater than the specs of the doorway of the heichal. And yet here Rav is saying that as long as there's an amaltera on it, it could be higher than 20 amos. But the heichal also had an amaltera, and we see that it couldn't be higher than 20 amos. So how do you reconcile this contradiction in Rav? Amar Rav Yosef, amaltera masnisai, man katanila. So Rav Yosef first off says, you're making a mistake. This was not stated by Rav. Rav was not the one who said that if you have an amaltera above the doorway of a mavoi, then it's going to be kosher even if it's higher than 20 amos. That's actually a brisa. And who was the author of that brisa? And I think that this is being asked rhetorically. That Rav Yosef is really saying, well, maybe it's not a legitimate brisa. Maybe Rav doesn't have to reckon with it. And Amar Abaye v'hachama berei derabba baravua ketanila. So Abaye says, wait a minute, what are you talking about? Chama berei derabba baravua, who's a legitimate Amora, who's trustworthy, he's the one who taught this brisa. And therefore, if he taught this brisa, then it's a serious brisa. So therefore the Gemara says, V'tihavi amaltera masnisa v'tikshil Rav. And therefore we have this question. The question that remains is that even if Rav didn't state the halacha, but he has a brisa, there's a brisa out there that contradicts Rav's halacha. Rav's halacha is that the doorway of the movi can be no higher than the doorway of the heichal, period, no matter what kinds of accessories you add to it. And yet here the brisa says that as long as you add an amaltera to the top of the door, it could be higher than 20 amos. Yeah.
Is there some operating principle? What's the operating principle about the limit of the height and why the amaltera would extend that?
You're going to find out in just a few moments. Hold on to your hats, but it's a very valid question. We're just not up to there yet. So Amar L'cha Rav Dal Ana Mehacha Masniyasa Milokashina Hadadi. So Rav says, why are you sticking me into the middle of this issue? This is not my debate. This is not my controversy. I was just citing for you a brisa. We learned yesterday a brisa that Rav had quoted that said that the doorway of a mavoi has to be no higher than 20 amos, just like the doorway of the heichal. The brisa was the one that created the correlation between a mavoi pesach and a heichal pesach. So therefore, don't attack me. You got two brises that are up against each other, because this brisa says that it could be higher than 20 amos as long as it's an amaltera. So Elamai Yislach Lameimar Tanoihi, L'didi Nami Tanoihi. The only thing that you can conclude is a machlokas tanoim. There's two brises. One holds that it has to be no higher than the heichal doorway, and the other one says no, as long as it's an amaltera, it's okay. So if that's the case, says Rav, so I can take sides. I'll side with the brisa that holds that it can be no higher than 20 amos. End of story. Rav Nachum bar Yitzchak Omar, below Rav, Masniyasa Hadadi Lo Kasha. So Rav Nachman bar Yitzchak says it's not so easy, Rav. It's not so simple to answer that way, because without Rav's statement that the doorway can be no larger than the doorway of the heichal, I would not have a contradiction of brises. You know why? Because l'Rabbanan Korah Taimamai Mishum Hekera B'Haita Katani Yesam Epislo Shel Heichal Simna Ba'alma. Because, and this is where we get to answer your question, Mike, what's the whole reason why a doorway of a mavoi cannot be higher than 20 amos? Because you need to have something recognizable. You need to have a visual reminder when you walk into the mavoi that this is not a standard Rishus Harabim. There's been an accommodation made such to allow me to carry inside this mavoi. That's what the rabbis had in mind when they told you to put a korah or a lechi on the doorway when you walk into the mavoi. And that's why, if it's higher than 20 amos, it won't be visible to a regular passerby. It's too high. And so, therefore, it could very well be that when the brisa said that it has to be 20 amos high, like the heichal, it wasn't saying that the heichal is the source text to teach me the halacha. There's no textual basis for this halacha. It's based on svara. It's based on logic. That whatever you're going to put up there has to be visible to the passerby. And all they're saying that it has to be the dimensions of the heichal is to remind you. You want to know what's visible to a passerby? Remind yourself of the dimensions of the doorway of the heichal. That'll tell you what's visible. And that way, it's not a contradiction, because you know why an amaltera allows you to have a doorway higher than 20 amos? Because an amaltera is a distinguishing feature that a person's going to look, even if it's higher than 20 amos, because ooh, look at that amaltera. That's the whole reason. So and therefore you don't have to say there's a contradiction in the Bryce. It's only according to Rav is there a contradiction between the two Bryces. But if you learn, like we've just presented to it, that the whole purpose of comparing it to the Heichel is just as a siman ba'alma, just as a reminder about what is considered to be visible, what's not considered to be visible, then it's not a contradiction at all. V'Rav Nachman bar Yitzchak hanicha ilo svira leha derabba, ela isvira leha derabba. So now the Gemara says, okay, Rav Nachman bar Yitzchak, you've explained beautifully the whole concept of why the mavoi doorway can't be higher than 20 amos. And that's great if you don't hold like Rabbah in his discussion of the laws of Sukkah. But if you hold like Rabbah, then you're going to have problems. What did Rabbah say? The Omar Rabbah, ksiv laman yedu doroseichem ki basuko so shavti. The Torah says that your generations, your future descendants have to know. And that's the reason why I'm giving you the law of Sukkah, so that your generations will look at the Sukkah and they'll remember that I put you in booths when you were leaving Egypt and traveling through the desert. So from that halacha, Rabbah says, Ad esrim ama adam yodeya shadar besukah lamaylam esrim ama ein adam yodeya mishum delo shalta be'ena. Rabbah says almost the exact same thing that Rav Nachman bar Yitzchak had said by Mavoi. Rabbah says, you know why a sukkah can't be higher than 20 amos? Because if the schach is so high, the schach won't be visible to the normal person who's inside the sukkah because it's too high. So the whole issue is visibility, recognizability. And if that's the case, then we have a problem. Alma gabe sukkanami behekera pligi, iflug betarti lamali. So the question is, why then do we have the same machlokas between the Chachamim and Rebbe Yehuda, whether it can be higher than 20 amos or not, discussed in both places? If the basis of the machlokas is exactly the same, is recognizability limited to 20 amos or not? So then why do they have to argue in both places? Just write it in one place and I'll know to apply it to the other place. The Gemara answers Shrich, I'll tell you why. Di'iyashmi'inan gabe sukkah b'haka amar Rebbe Yehuda kevin dili yeshiva avida shalta be'ena. Very simply, if I only had this discussion by the laws of Sukkah, I might have argued as follows. You know why Rebbe Yehuda says that the schach can be higher than 20 amos? For the very simple reason is that when you're sitting in a Sukkah for a prolonged period of time, you'll eventually look up and say, oh, that's schach, even if it's 30 amos high. But if you're walking past an entranceway to a mavoi, since you're not tarrying by the doorway, it's much more difficult to see something that you're just walking past if it's higher than 20 amos. So maybe Rebbe Yehuda would agree to the Chachamim by Mavoi that it has to be limited to 20 amos. And if I only had the machlokas presented by the laws of Eruvin by Mavoi, I would have said the only time the Chachamim limit the height of the Pesach to 20 amos is only when you're passing by it. But if you're tarrying and sitting down in a sukkah, eventually lift up your eyes, and maybe they would agree to Rebbe Yehuda that it could be higher than 20 amos the schach. And therefore you need to write it by both cases. So now finally we get to define what an amaltera is. My amaltera. Rav Chama berei de Rabba Baravua Amar Kini. So this Amora says, Rav Chama says, that it's a type of nest facsimile. Basically, the builders, they did an ornamental accessory, some kind of molding above the doorway in the shape of nests, of bird nests. And it was very distinctive in its appearance. And therefore, when you passed by the doorway of the Heichal, you looked up and you saw something that looked very unusual and very, artistic. Ki asa Rav Dimi Omar, Amri b'ma'arava, Paski da'arza. And Rav Dimi said that the rabbis in Eretz Yisrael said that's not what the definition is. The definition is protruding beams of cedar wood would come out on top of the door frame of the Heichal. And so basically that's also a distinctive feature. It's just not as distinctive as these ornamental bird nest facsimiles. Man do Omer Piske da'arza kol shekain kini, man do Omer kini avol Piske da'arza lo. That if you hold that it was cedar wood protruding out of the door frame, so then that's not as distinctive as these artistic bird nests. So certainly you would agree that if you had artistic bird nests, then that would also be a distinctive feature that would grab the eye. And therefore, if your mavoi entrance was higher than 20 amos, but you had bird nest, molding, that would be fine. But if you hold But if you hold that the ornament was these distinctive bird nest facsimiles, then protruding beams of cedar wood is too plain, is not as distinctive enough, and therefore that wouldn't do the trick. So now, uman da'amar piskei da'arza maitaima mishum denafish mashche. So why is it, if you hold that these protruding beams of cedar wood is considered to be distinctive enough, what's the reason why it's considered distinctive? Why? Because it protrudes outwards, and therefore it's going to catch the eye. V'hasukkah denafish mashche ukami rabbanan delo. But look, the ceiling of a sukkah protrudes. I mean, it extends much farther than a door frame. So, because you're sitting you're sitting underneath it. So, why isn't that enough by itself? Just having sitting under schach, why, even if it's higher than 20 amos, why isn't that sufficient? If protruding beams of wood is sufficient to allow for higher than 20 amos. Elakevin de kachashiv is lekala. Answers the Gemara. It's not just the fact that it protrudes outwards and it extends over you, but it's also got to be chashiv. It's got to be something that's expensive, something that's important, something that's a feat of architecture. That's the thing that makes it distinctive and will cause people to talk about it. And that's why it's something that's eye-grabbing, and therefore the Mavui entrance can be higher than 20 amos. Yeah.
Is the Gemara going to talk about the whether you need a Korah along with the altar? Or, I mean, why would you need both?
Yeah, I believe the assumption is that the amaltera goes over the korah, because you can't have an amaltera unless you have some kind of door frame below it. The amaltera is an accessory to a door frame. It's not something that can stand. How is it constructed? Remember. Okay, good. Remember, the whole idea of the entranceway to the mavui is that it's not a door frame. It's not a door frame. It's two walls. And with an open entrance to the mavui.
Making the korah as like a...
The korah is your crossbeam on top of the two walls.
It's not a
so your amaltera can't exist without something supporting
you have it's for some reason we had a built-in door frame, maybe you wouldn't need a korah.
Exactly. We learned that already. We also learned that if you have a built-in door frame, the doorway can be wider than 10 amos. Remember? Okay. Let us go on. Okay. Where are we? We're at the two dots. Now, mixes korah b'soch esrim, mixes korah l'mayla me'esrim, mixes schach b'soch esrim, mixes schach u'mixes schach l'mayla me'esrim, Omar Rabba b'mavoi kosher b'sukkah pasel. So the Gemara now explains as follows. Now, we learned in our Mishnah that if you have the door frame, or the korah, the cross beam, if it's higher than 20 amos, you have to lower it. What happens if the majority of the beam is higher than 20 amos, but a small percentage of it is down below the 20 amma line, the 20 amma measuring point? And similarly, what if the majority of the thickness of the schach is above 20 amos, but a tiny little layer of the schach dips down below the 20 amma point? What's the halacha? So Rabbi says, b'mavui kosher b'sukkah pasel. In the mavui case, it's kosher, because you have the crossbeam a little bit slightly lower, dipping down, but by the sukkah, it's pasel. Maishna b'mavui de kosher. Why? So why are you making this distinction? Why are you saying in the mavui it's kosher? The amrinan kolush. Because we say, well, just imagine the part of the crossbeam that's above 20 amos is not there. Just imagine that it disappeared. You'd still have a small little korah, very thin korah, covering the top of your entrance. So sukkah nami lema kolosh. I want to say the same thing by the sukkah. Just imagine that schach above the 20 amos point disappeared, and you're fine. So the Gemara says, "Ikalashta havli alei chamasam eruba mitzilasa." No, the Gemara says you can't do that, because if you imagine that schach above the 20 amma line disappears, then all you have is this very, very thin layer of schach, which is not going to be enough to provide enough shade. And we know that there has to be more shade than sunlight, and you're not going to have that. But hachanami kalashta havli alei korah hanitelas beruach. But the Gemara says, but wait a minute. If you imagine 99% of the korah missing and just a thin layer that's dipping down below the 20 amma point, then that's not a kosher korah either, because the halacha is that any korah that is so flimsy that a wind can blow it off easily, that's not a kosher korah. So if, like, you make a korah out of paper or cardboard, that's not a kosher korah, because the wind can easily blow it away. So the Gemara says, Ela al karchach nasu kishpudin shel mateches, hachanami al karchach nasu silas meruba mechamasa. So what are you going to say? I'm going to explain this according to the way Rashi understands it. You have to say that even though you imagine the top part of the beam as invisible, but it's not that it's totally not there. It still provides the sturdiness to the portion that's remaining below the 20 amma point. And if that's the case, the schach that's above the 20 amma point is invisible, but it's still there vis-a-vis providing the shade that's necessary for the sukkah. Amar Rav, so the question therefore is, why is there any difference between the mavui, which we say is kosher, and the sukkah, which we say is pasul? Amar Rava mi par zakaya, sukkah diliyachid lo mitkar, mavi dilarabba mitkari ahadadi. The answer is like this. By a sukkah, there's only one person who owns the sukkah. He's not going to be so careful to make sure that the schach that's below the 20 amma point is always going to be intact. What if it shrivels? What if the schach shrinks? What if some of it falls down? He's not going to be so mindful of the fact that, oh, I don't have any more schach below the 20 amma point, I got to fix it. But when you have something that's owned publicly, you have so many people watching over it, so each one will remind the other, Rabbi Sai, we got to remember to make sure that the korah remains below the 20 amma point, and therefore we don't have to worry as much about it. That's the difference. Ravina says, I'll give you a different svara. Sukkah de'oraisa achmira barabanan, mabi de'rabanan lo achmira barabanan. The whole din of sukkah is a Torah law, and therefore the chachamim are machmir that even if a small portion of the schach is above the 20 amas, it's no good. Whereas the whole din of korah, the whole accommodation of korah in a mavui is only a rabbinic requirement, and therefore the chachamim are not so machmir. Rav Ada bar Masna Masti lo hashmaita de Rabbi Ibcha. There's a very ironic Gemara because this Amora teaches the whole halacha of Rabba the exact opposite. You're going to see the irony in just a second. Amar Rabba b'mavoi pasul b'sukkah keshera. And that Rabba says what? That no, just the opposite. In a mavoi, if you have some of the korah above and some of it below the 20 amma point, the whole thing is pasul. And only in a sukkah where some of the schach is above, some is below, there do we say it's kosher. So maishno sukkah de kasher, they're meaning kolosh, but mavinomen lema kolosh. So again, the whole shakla. Why are you telling me that it's kosher by a sukkah? Because you imagine the schach that's above as not being there. Say the same thing by the korah. So I kalashta habyolei korah, and he tell us beruach. The answer is the reason you can't imagine the stuff above the 20 amma point by the korah as not being there, because otherwise you'd have too flimsy of a korah, and it's not kosher. But hachanami kalashta habyolei chamas mislasa. They say the same thing by the schach. If you imagine that schach above 20 amma is not there, then you don't have enough schach to provide sufficient shade. So ela al karchach nasu silasam ruba mechamasa hachanami al karchach nasu kishpudin shel mateches. So you have to say that just like by the schach, even though you imagine the schach not being there, but not to the point where it doesn't provide sufficient shade, so too when you imagine the beam above the 20 amas not being there, it's still there as far as the sturdiness of the part that's below the 20 amas. So again, we have this question: what's the difference? Amarava mi parzakaya sukkah deliyachid hi rami anafshi amidkar mavi delarabim hi samchi ahadadi velo midkari. The answer is just the opposite from what we said before. By a sukkah, when it's owned by one person, one individual who has the responsibility over a mitzvah will be much more responsible and careful to make sure that it is kosher. But if you have a group of people that are responsible to take care of something of a religious significance, they're constantly going to be thinking the other guy will take care of it. That's why when you walk into a shul, sometimes the place is a mess. You walk into the beis medrash, you walk into the synagogue, there's talesim all over the place, there's sidurim all over the place. No one bothers cleaning up. You walk into this room, there's svarim all over the place. Why? Because someone says, hey, what's got nothing to do with me? Someone else will take care of it, right? Right? And if everyone says that, and it's your house of God, so what happens? The place remains a mess. And that's the same thing that's going to happen. Am I getting my point across? So, okay, good. So the Gemara is saying the same thing. The Gemara is saying over here, when everyone's going to be walking past the mavoi, they may notice, hey, you know what? It's a taka that the wood that used to be below the 20 amma point, I think it's starting to get a little thin over there. But someone else will take care of it. The shamas will take care of it. We don't have a shamas? No. Anyway, the Amri Inchi, Kedera de Veishut Filo Chamimi Velo Karira. As the famous saying goes, if a pot is owned by partners, it'll never get hot and it'll never get cold. Meaning that if two of us are responsible, like, two guys living together in the apartment, who's making dinner tonight? I thought you were making. No, I thought you were making. So they're gonna go hungry. The pot will never get hot and never get cold because the other guy's relying on the other guy. Ravina says, also an ironic opposite from what we said before, Sukkah deoraisa lo boi chizuk, movi derabanan boi chizuk. Before we had said that they're more machmir by deoraisas than derabbanans. Here it's just the opposite. Since Sukkah is a din deoraisa, the rabbis did not feel a need to be machmir because it's a Torah law. No one's going to play games with a Torah law. So even if you notice that the Sukkah's schach is becoming a danger of going above 20 amos, you'll immediately take care of it. But when it comes to a mavui, since it's only a rabbinic law to begin with, people will be more lax with it, and therefore they said you have to be more machmir and say anything that's above the 20 amos is possible. My haviyallah. So what was the final upshot? So Rabbi bar Rav Ula Amar Zevazet Pasul, Rabbi Amar Zevazet Kosher. So here you have, instead of Rabbi's statement of before that one's kosher and one's pasul, here you have Rabbi bar Rav Ula saying that in both cases it's pasul, and Rabbi says that in both cases it's kosher. Now listen to Rabbi's svara. He says Chalal Sukkah Tanan, Chalal Mavui Tanan. That it's not that when the Mishnah says that if it's higher than 20 amos it's pasul, it's not referring to the crossbeam. It's referring to the space. And what the Mishnah is saying in both Sukkah and Mavui is that if the airspace is above 20 amos, then it's pasul. But if the beam is just at the 20 amma line, so that the airspace below the beam is not above 20 amos, so then it's totally kosher. That's how you're supposed to interpret the Mishnah. And therefore, you can even have the entire beam at the 20 amma point with nothing of the beam protruding into the 20 amma mark, and it'll still be kosher as long as the airspace of the doorway does not go above the 20 amma point. So the Gemara says, Amalei Rav Papa Rava Tanya de Masayelach. There's actually a brisa that supports your interpretation, because it says, Mavoi shehu gavoa me estrim amma Yoseph me pischo shel heichal yemait veheichal gufo chalalo esrim. This brisa, the version of this brisa is that if a mavui is higher than 20 amos, more than the doorway of the heichal, you have to lower the korah, and the heichal itself, its airspace was 20 amos high. So you see that we're talking about the airspace, not about the crossbeam itself. So Eisei Rav Shimi Barav Ashi Rav Papa. Let's challenge that, Rav Papa. There's a brisa that says, Ketzad Haya Oseh. How would you make the doorway of the mavoi? Meniach Korah Misvas Esrim Ulamata. That you have to place the crossbeam 20 and below, which implies that it has to be within the 20 amos. Not that it can be above the 20 amos, but it has to be within the 20 amos, because that's what ulamata implies. So the Gemara says, Ema ulamaila. No. The way you were supposed to read it is, it can be 20 or above 20, meaning as long as the airspace does not go above 20. But if the korah starts at 20, then it can go above 20. As long as the airspace doesn't go above 20. So that's how you'd understand it. Correct the Gemara v'halamata kitani. But doesn't it say in the brisa that the crossbeam has to go up to 20 and below, has to go below 20? The Gemara says, no, hakamash malan, that's not what the word lomata means in that context. It's telling me a halacha, de lamata kilamala, malamayla chalala esrim, aflamata chalala asara. What it means is as follows, that there are two shiurim for the vertical measurements of the height of the doorway. One is the maximal measurements of 20 amos, but there's also a minimal measurement. What's the minimal height of the doorway? 10 tfachim. Let's say you wanted to make a mavui entrance for midgets, right? So you'd have a very small doorway, but the minimal height of that doorway is 10 tfachim. And what the brisa therefore is telling you is that just like the measurement of 20 amos height is the airspace, the maximal airspace height, so too the minimum height is also measured by the airspace, not by the korah as part of that space. And therefore what it's telling you is that if you have a korah that dips down into the 10 tfachim height, then the doorway is going to be possible. Yeah.
The whole thing operates on what you can see and what you can't see. So how does airspace play a role over here?
No. It plays a role in as far as how high you're going to look up. As long as the korah is at the 20 amma height, you'll be able to see it.
So if you put up a wall then it doesn't work. It doesn't.
What do you mean? You put how are you supposed to get in?
Well, there are courtyards that come into that mavoi, right? So
no, there's no entrance to the courtyards other than the mavoi. The mavoi is the access way to the
people
chaseros.
In the houses, they have access.
How do they have access? You're coming in from Rishus Harabim.
Right. But the people are already inside, I'm saying.
And how are they going to get out?
Doesn't matter. They're inside. If they put up a wall, they can't carry there.
No. 1 second.
So it's not a mavoi then.
If I put a wall to block traffic, you can't live there anymore.
This you can.
What?
For a day, for Shabbos, I'm saying. Talking about carrying. You're saying if the door is lower than 10, it's not a door.
No, that isn't practical. How are you going to build a wall for one day and then knock it down? It's not even oleh al adat. I mean, why would people do such a thing? Why would you build a wall to knock it down in 25 hours? I guess in theory, of course, it would work because you're building an enclosure. But the accommodation that Chazal are making is you don't have to build a wall. It's not.
I think if you make the Pesach lower than 10, it's possible.
That's right. That's right, because it's not considered to be an access way anymore. It's not. I mean, we'll have to see why. Your point is, well, what's the big deal? You're actually making a better enclosure.
Right. Because people won't.
So it's a valid question, but we'll have to see why that is. Perhaps it's no longer part of the institutionalized takana. It's open, but it's not open in a way that Chazal instituted. Okay, Amar Abaya Mishmei Rav Nachman, Amas Sukkah va'amas Mavoi ba'ama bas Chamisha, Amas Kilayim ba'ama bas Shisha. So Abaya says an interesting statement in the name of Rav Nachman. He says that there are two types of amas. There's two types of yardsticks that are an amma long. One is 5 tfachim in length, and one is 6 tfachim in length. Sometimes in halacha we use the 5 tefach amma, and sometimes we use the 6 tefach amma. A tefach is a hand breadth, which is usually measured in 4 fingers because that's the width of your fist, right? Or like this, or like this, and so sometimes we use a hand breadth of that is 5 of them to make up an amma. Sometimes we use 6, but it all depends on whether it's a chumrah or a kula. So when it comes to the law of mavoi and it comes to the laws of sukkah, we use an amma that is 5 tfachim. 5 tfachim, and when it comes to the laws of kilayim, which is the prohibition of planting grain nearby a vineyard, we use an amma of 6 tfachim, and we're going to speak this out. Let's speak it. So amas mavoi ba'ama bas chamisha l'may hilchasa. So let's talk about the mavoi first. When you're telling me that your amma is measured as 5 tfachim, so what are the ramifications? Legovo ulapirtzas mavoi. It has to do with the height of the doorway. The maximal height is 20 amos, so it's a chumrah. When we say that it can be up to 20 amos high, it's using the smaller amma, so that's a greater stringency, that we're lowering the maximal height. And also as far as the pirza, as we'll see later on, let's say someone knocks a hole into the side of the mavoi so that it's now open to Rishus Harabim. So does that invalidate the mavois, as being a place where you can carry? It depends. If the breach is less than 10 amos, so then it's still kosher to carry inside that mavoi. We'll talk more about that later, but the point is that the breach that's measured in 10 amos is the smaller amos, so that's a chumrah. Okay, that's the halacha by mavoi. So frak the Gemara v'ha'ika meshach mavoi ba'arba amos de l'kula. So but wait a minute, if you're always going to use the smaller amma, it's going to result in a kula for another halacha. Because there's a halacha that talks about the minimum length of a mavoi in order to allow you to carry in that mavoi, to create a shituf, to create like an eruv inside that mavoi. And the minimal length is 4 amos. So if you're going to use the smaller amma, then it's a kula, because it's allowing you to have a shorter mavoi than the other measurement. The Gemara says, Kamanda Amar ba'arba tfachim. So one answer is that there's a machlokes whether the minimal length of a mavoi is measured in 4 amos, or whether it's measured in 4 tfachim. So you'll say that Rav Nachman holds that the minimal length is 4 tfachim, so it's not a factor for him. Another answer could be is that when Rav Nachman said that we always use the 5 tefach amma because it's a chumrah, he was saying vis-a-vis most halachas of a mavoi, it's l'chumrah. And that's why we use the 5 tefach amma. But for those areas where it's l'kula, we'll use the 6 tefach amma. Now, amma sukkah ba'ama bas chamish l'may hilchasa. Let's talk about now sukkah. What is the ramification as far as measuring in a shorter amma? Legova uledofen akuma. So here too, the maximal height of the schach, that's one, like we talked about before by the mavoi. And the second one has to do with dofen akuma. So let's just imagine we're sitting in a room now, and instead of the ceiling that you see above you, there's a big hole in the ceiling. And the ceiling opens up to the sky. So the Mishnah in Sukkah says that you can make that into a sukkah by covering the big hole in the middle of the ceiling with schach, and it's a kosher sukkah, provided that what? Provided that the remaining portions of the ceiling that are connected to the vertical walls are not horizontally protruding into the ceiling for more than 4 amos. If they protrude in for more than 4 amos, then you still have too much of a ceiling for it to be a kosher sukkah. If it's less than 4 amos, however, we say the principle of dofen akuma, that we look at the horizontal protrusions inwards as being a continuation of the vertical wall that just bends over a little bit on the sides. That's called the principle of a bent wall, dofen akuma, a bent wall that bends over slightly and it's okay. So that too is measured in the distance of 4 amos. And so therefore we're saying that you have to be machmer to use the small amma in order to make the sukkah kosher. V'ha'ika meshach sukkah ba'arba amos de l'kula. But one second, there's a kula that's going to result if you use the smaller amma, because according to one opinion, the minimal measurements of a sukkah are 4 by 4 amos. And if you use the smaller amma, then you're going to end up with a smaller sukkah as a kula. The Tanya Rebbe Omer ani kol sukkah she'in bo daled amos al daled amos psula. Rabbi Yehuda Nasi is of the opinion that if the sukkah is smaller than 4 by 4 amos, it's puzzle. So you see that the measurement is going to end up with a kula if you use the smaller amma. The Gemara says one answer is kerabanan damrinan afilu eina machzekes ela rosha v'ruba v'shulchano. That it could be that Rav Nachman holds like the Chachamim, who say that the minimal measurements of a sukkah are not measured in 4 amos by 4 amos, but rather whether you can fit your head and the majority of your body in your table in the sukkah, which that's how we paskin, which is just 7 tvachim by 7 tvachim. So it's not measured in amos. The second answer is, like we said before, by Mavoi, that when Rav Nachman said that we use the 5 tefach amma as our measurement because it's a chumrah, it's only for most halachas of sukkah, but for a minority of halachas of sukkah, we're going to use a different measurement because otherwise it will end up with a kula. And so what's the third halacha? Amas kilayim ba'ama b'shisha l'may hilchasa. When we say that the laws of kilayim use a larger amma because that's a chumrah over there, what are the ramifications? So we know that there has to be a distance placed between the planting of your grain and the planting of your vineyard, right? So, and that's measured in amos. And obviously, if you use the larger amma, that's a bigger chumrah. So lekarachas hakerem v'lim chol hakerem. It's for karachas hakerem and mechol hakerem, which the Gemara will explain just a minute, but I'll explain it to you now. Karachas hakerem means that you have a bald spot. That's what the word karachas means. A bald spot in the middle of your vineyard where there's nothing planted. So provided that that bald spot has certain dimensions, you can plant grain in the center of that bald spot in your vineyard. A mechol hakerem is where the side of your vineyard has a setback from the wall because you need to work with your plow on all sides of the vines. So therefore you can't plant your vines all the way up to the wall of your property because otherwise there won't be room for the tools that you need in order to cultivate the vine. So as long as there's sufficient distance between the wall of your property and the last row of vines, then you're allowed to, in that blank space, you can plant grain. Ditnan karachas hakerem beishamai omrim estim v'arba amos u'beisil omrim sheishes amos. That when it comes to the bald spot in the center of your vineyard, so then Beishamai say you need an area of 24 by 24 to allow you to plant, and Beisila says you need 16 by 16 amos to allow you to plant. Rashi goes through the permutation of these measurements, which we don't have time for today. U'mechol hakerem Beishamai omrim sheishes amos u'beisil omrim shteimes amos. When it comes to the end of your property between the last row of vines and the wall, so there too there's a machlokas between Beishamai and Beisila. Beishamai said you need 16 amos distance to allow you to plant grain, and Beisila says you only need 12 amos to plant. So Ezehi Karachas Hakerem, the Mishnah defines what is the definition of a bald spot in the vineyard. Kerem Shechariv Emtziiso, Ein Sham Sheisesrei Amos Lo Yovi Zera L'Sham. Hayu Sheisesrei Amos nosein lo kidei avodaso v'zareya es hamosar. That the definition is if you have a bald spot in the center of your vineyard, so then according to Beis Hillel you need to have 16 by 16 in order for you to have sufficient space between the vines and the center of that bald spot, which will be, bounded on 8 amos on all sides. You have to have 4 amos for the plow to be able to cultivate the vines on all sides of this circle or square. And then you have 4 amos in all directions from the center seed that's in the center of that square. Ve'ezahu mechol hakerem. What's the definition of the side of the vineyard between the last row and the wall? Bein kerem legader. That's between the vineyard and the wall. Ein sham shtei mesrei ama lo yavi zera l'sham. Hayu sham shtei esrei ama nosin lo kedei avodasa v'zarei es hasha'ar. And therefore, by there too, the space between the last vine and the wall, if you have 12 amos, according to Beis Hillel, then as long as you distance yourself from the last vine 4 amos, then you have space on all sides, 4 amos on all directions between the seed and the wall, and between the seed and the vines, you have room to plant. So now the Gemara says, okay, but by kilayim too, if you use the larger amma, you're going to end up with a kula too, because beha'ikar ritzufim ba'arba amos de la kula. There's a principle called ritzufim, which is going to end up with a leniency. What is the halacha of ritzufim? It's basically this. In order for there to be a prohibition of planting seeds in a vineyard, it has to be defined as a vineyard. What is the definition of a vineyard? That the rows of vines have to be sufficiently spaced from each other in order to be cultivated properly. But if you plant vines willy-nilly because you don't know what in the world you're doing, then it's not called a vineyard. It's not called a kerem anymore. It's just called a guy who's just playing around out in the soil. And there you don't have the same prohibition of having to distance so far in planting your seeds. You just have to make a much smaller distance from your seeds and your vines. And that would end up to be a kula, because how do you define the proper distance space between one row of vines and the other for it to be defined as a vineyard? 4 amos. Right? So therefore, ditnan kerem hanatua al pachos me arba amos. Reb Shimon omer eno kerem chachamim omer kerem. That Reb Shimon says that if you have the spaces of the rows less than 4 amos, then it's not called a vineyard anymore, and therefore the limitations that we just discussed don't apply. Now, if you're going to use a larger amma, then it's going to turn out that this is a kula, because if you were to use the shorter amma, maybe this would no longer be defined as a vineyard. Maybe this would it would still be defined as a vineyard, but by using the larger amma, it's no longer defined as a vineyard, and you have a kula of now being allowed to plant seeds in much closer proximity. And it's only the chachamim who say that it still is a vineyard. V'roen esayim soim ki'ilu eina. And the reason why the Chachamim say that even if the rows are more proximal to each other than 4 amos, it's because what you do is you just imagine one row as having disappeared, and therefore you can still say that it's still called a legitimate vineyard. So the Gemara says, so one answer would be, is Kerabanan, Darmi Havi Keren, that one answer to defend Rav Nachman is that he'll hold like the Chachamim who say that there is no measurement of 4 amos necessary between one row and the other, because he holds like the Chachamim who say that if they're planted too closely to each other, you just imagine that one of the rows disappears. V'ibayis Ema, another answer could be, La'olam Karib Shimon V'rov Amos Ka'omar, that he really holds like Reb Shimon. He holds like Reb Shimon. And when he says that you use the larger amma for the laws of Kilayim, it's for most of the laws of Kilayim. Now, finally, V'Rava Mishmei de Rav Nachman Omar, Rava disagrees with Abaya. Abaya had quoted Rav Nachman as saying that for certain things we use a 5 tefach amma, for other things we use a 6 tefach amma. Rava says that's not what Rav Nachman said. Kol amos ba'ama ba'shisha. For all halachas, we always use a 6 tefach amma. Ella halalu sochakos v'halalu atzavos. But he says, but one kind of tefach is a happy tefach, and the other kind of tefach is a sad tefach. What do we mean by a happy tefach and a sad tefach? We always use a 6 tefach standard. It's just that sometimes the tefach is like it's smiling. So when you have fingers that are like loosely positioned, relaxed, they're like a person who's smiling because he's relaxed. And when you have them clenched tightly, like it's a person who's upset, right? Like a person who's tense or nervous, that's called a sad tefach. And therefore, just that sometimes the tefach is more compacted, sometimes the tefach is a little bit looser, and there are two different measurements of amos. L'chumra, we always use the smaller amma, or based on the clenched tefach, and the chumrah will also use the more relaxed tefach of 6 tefachim to make up an amma, where the tefachim are slightly larger. And now we'll discuss this halacha more carefully tomorrow. Have a wonderful day.